Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this week's episode of Horns, we listen to Carrie Filipetti talking about U.S. policy toward Latin America, specifically the authoritarian countries of Venezuela and Cuba during the last administration. Filipetti discusses the efforts in order to bring all the tools of government, or as it's frequently called in DoD circles, the dime, for diplomatic, information, military, and economic power to bear in order to change the behaviors and processes of these two regimes. She offers a frank assessment of the areas where she believes they were successful, as well as areas in which she believed they struggled, and the reasons why so. This is a fascinating insight into an area of foreign policy that is often underappreciated by foreign policy wonks. Let's listen in.
Good afternoon, everybody. As you are digging into your lunchtime nibbles, welcome to the third in a row of really interesting foreign policy talks taking place here at 12:15 in the Bass Lecture Hall. So quite a week to be at the University of Texas. Most of you know I'm Will Inboden. I'm the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security, one of your hosts for today. And I'm also honored to be the Faculty Advisor for the Alexander Hamilton Society, your other host for today. So befitting these two banners here. As you know, it's always a pleasure to introduce any of the speakers we have coming to campus. It's a great benefit, of course, of UT being able to engage with so many thoughtful scholars and policy professionals. But this one in particular is especially exciting for me because I'm such a fan of Carrie Filipetti and her work and the friend that she's become over the last few years. Her policy career includes working for Ambassador Nikki Haley when she was a U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and then more recently being the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Cuba and Venezuela. And of course, Carrie will be drawing on that quite a bit in her remarks today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the State Department organizational chart, suffice it to say that meant that she was essentially the point person, the top U.S. official at the State Department handling relations with those two very complicated countries. So she knows of what she speaks. Carrie is currently the Executive Director of the Vandenberg Coalition, where I'm also honored to be on the advisory board. You're seeing some common themes here. And Vandenberg, let me just put in a little plug for Vandenberg here. Is a new organization just started, just about 2 years ago, is it now? Yeah, 1 year. My goodness, time flies. Yeah. 1 year ago, trying to maintain or in some ways even resurrect what Senator Arthur Vandenberg himself stood for. And since on the side, I moonlight as a history professor, quick little history lesson here. In the 1930s, Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan was one of the leading, if you will, isolationist voices in the United States. After the scars and traumas of World War I, the United States had retreated from much involvement in international affairs, wanted to hide behind the comfort and repose of our two ocean barriers and our hemispheric isolation from the conflicts in Europe and Asia. And Senator Vandenberg was a leading voice representing Michigan, saying the United States should not be getting involved in those European conflicts and squabbles, leave them to them. With Pearl Harbor, with the rise of Nazi Germany, and then with, of course, America's eventual entry into World War II, Senator Vandenberg showed a rare quality among politicians, which was humility and courage. He had the humility to admit that he'd been wrong about being an isolationist, and the courage to accept the consequences of that and to embrace a new role as a leading voice for internationalism. And it took a special amount of courage because he was doing this under two Democratic presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and then Harry Truman. But as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Republican chairman of it, Vandenberg was a key partner with the Democratic president, Harry Truman, on things like America's entry into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the passage of the Marshall Plan, providing billions of dollars in reconstruction aid for Europe, the Truman Doctrine, so on and so forth. And so it's in that spirit of a bipartisan commitment to American international engagement and American international leadership that Carrie and her team have resurrected the spirit of Vandenberg with the Vandenberg Coalition. So she's doing some great work with that now. So she's going to be talking to us about American policy and policy instruments towards Cuba and Venezuela. So we'll hear from Carrie. So please join me in giving a warm UT Austin welcome to Carrie Filipetti.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's great to be in Austin. I'm from DC, so the weather's a lot nicer down here, and the people are also a lot nicer, so I appreciate your taking the time to come listen. I'm really grateful to you, Will, to the Clements Center, the Alexander Hamilton Society for bringing me here as well. So some of you may be wondering why we've called this lecture the American Toolbox. It really stems from something that I've noticed in watching congressional hearings and testimony, which is you often hear national security experts talking about using all the tools in our toolbox. And then you start asking what those tools are, and oftentimes they don't give you very concrete answers. In fact, many times people will look at what the Trump administration, for example, did and view that as using the tools of kinetic power, which is a threat of military force, as well as economic sanctions, which are tools of more brute power than soft power. So in the decades following the Second World War and the Cold War, in part thanks to the bureaucratic structures that had been developed, American foreign policy kind of settled into a bit of a routine. And so talking about what the tools in our toolkit are and updating those tools is, I think, an important part of anybody who's in a foreign policy position. We're now at this moment, and this goes along with something that Will mentioned about why we established the Vandenberg Coalition, this idea that we're now at this new moment where foreign policy is shifting. We're facing a set of threats, whether they're emanating from China or elsewhere, that are different from any threats that we had faced prior to today. And that means we need to look at the opportunities that are presented by new technologies, by new emerging relationships, in order to really update our toolkit. So in my service at the Department of State, my responsibility was to implement American foreign policy as it related to Cuba and Venezuela. So I want to use the lens of those two countries and the administration's policies towards those countries to highlight what exactly we mean by the tools in America's toolbox, what was effective and what wasn't effective. Because I think there are some serious limitations that future policymakers, like many of you in the room, should be thinking about in order to improve the creativity of our foreign policy landscape. I also think it's an interesting lens because Cuba and Venezuela are often seen as two countries where American foreign policy really was not creative. Many people have criticized my service in the government as being focused exclusively on a sanctions policy. And so I'm hoping over the course of this conversation, we'll be able to talk about some of the other creative options and where sanctions fit over the overarching framework that we were using to try to force democratic change on both the island of Cuba and the country of Venezuela. So first and foremost, I just want to ask, is anybody here sort of a Latin America history buff or somebody who studies specifically Latin America? Okay, a few of you. So that's not unusual. Usually, people in foreign policy are focused on Europe or the Middle East or something like that. So for you, I do just want to do a bit of a scene setting for those of you who don't focus on Latin America policy, because I think the most important question that we need to ask when we're dealing with other countries is a very simple one, which is, does this matter? Does this matter to American values? Does this matter to American interests? And if it doesn't, or if the United States can't or isn't willing to use the resources to push for whatever change we're trying to see, then we're not really getting into the tools of our toolkit. I want to talk a little bit about why Cuba and Venezuela matter to us. First and foremost, there's obviously the values piece of this. One of the most interesting things about the United States is that we are not a purely transactional country when it comes to our relationships abroad, and we do still continue to support democratic values and freedom abroad. Sometimes more than we should, with interventions that are maybe going a bridge too far, but we always do care about making sure that we can have a stronger peace, which will stem from more democratic nations. But there's also the interests piece of this. In the words of Senator Arthur Vandenberg, we support American principled leadership, quote, for our own sake, not just because it's better for the world, but also because it's fundamentally in American interests. And so the American interests in the region are pretty profound. Number one, there's countering China, countering the influence of Russia, and countering the influence of Iran, three adversaries that have established footholds primarily in Venezuela and Cuba in an effort to antagonize the United States and our interests. So it's important that we're able to defend the democratic actors in these countries in order to preserve against the influence of some of those actors who are obviously using as many tools as they have available to try to counter American interests. The second interest is just American security. So There are more deaths by the narcotics trafficking coming from the Western Hemisphere and in some cases from China than there are deaths from terrorism operations across the world. So just last year, we had over 100,000 overdose deaths, largely from fentanyl that was coming across the border from the Western Hemisphere. So this is something that matters deeply to the American public, to make sure that we're not only fighting the demand signals here in the United States, but also the supply signals that are coming from the region. We also have an interest in public health and safety, which is where border security does come in, particularly post-COVID. I think it's very obvious how what affects one country very quickly will affect another country. And so we want to make sure that we're preserving our borders and making sure that we're not having a public health crisis that could potentially harm the American population. So there's very tangible interests and values at stake when it comes to the Western Hemisphere. And in particular, Cuba and Venezuela. So getting into what our policy was and how we use these various tools. So I'll do a little bit of scene setting about what was happening in 2019, which is when I pivoted from working for Ambassador Haley into working as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for these countries. So with respect to Cuba, many of you are aware that in 2015, the Obama administration engaged in a new strategy which was intended to warm the relations between the United States and Cuba. And the idea here was a very obvious idea, which is for many decades, we had been using maximum pressure. There obviously hadn't been even an incremental shift towards democratic reform or more market-based economies. And so the idea was, let's see if opening up our relationship will be effective. It was believed that doing this would improve the human rights situation on the island and eventually lead to longer-term economic reforms and political reforms as well. But unfortunately, that's not what we saw happening. So the Cuban Commission on Human Rights and National Reconciliation had found that there were a total of almost 10,000 arbitrary detentions documented in 2016, the year after the warming of the relations, which was the highest figure since 2010. So the rate had risen from around 172 incidents per month on the island in 2010 to, after the warming of relations, well over 800 incidents per month on the island. So the fear was that instead of improving the lives of everyday Cubans, which was the intent behind this policy, it inadvertently improved the lives of the politicians at the expense of everyday Cubans. And so the Castro regime was not only harming the Cuban people themselves, but was also exporting a lot of its torture and other control measures to the Venezuelans. So we were starting to see it expand beyond its borders. In terms of Venezuela, just a quick history here. So 2018 is when the sort of major crisis really began. So from 2014 until 2017, there had been a series of protests inside Venezuela, really mass mobilization against the leadership of Nicolas Maduro, who was the successor to Hugo Chavez. And the reason for this was because there was an increase in the amount of graft, corruption, human rights violations, and so on in the country that at one point was the wealthiest country in the Western Hemisphere. So in 2018, we saw the more recent in what was a series of unfair elections inside Venezuela. So Nicolas Maduro was elected for another term as president. This was a completely illegitimate election, and it followed illegitimate elections for the National Assembly that had taken place as well. So we had been seeing the majority of democratic institutions in Venezuela start to be taken over, and the 2018 presidential election was more or less the last straw. It's interesting that the same day that I became Deputy Assistant Secretary was the day that Juan Guaido became president of Venezuela. So you can imagine the chaos that I stepped into taking on that role at the same time. Looking at that landscape and seeing how human rights was really kind of the central priority here, but that there were also significant national security threats that I mentioned before emanating from the region, that gets into, okay, now we're in a position to use the tools of our national power. How many of you have heard, I'm sure many of you have, about the DIME framework? Have any of you heard about that? So the DIME framework is basically this tool that the Department of Defense has used to speak about the tools of national power. So it stands for diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. I think it's a little bit simplistic, but it does actually work very, very well to frame some of what we were doing in both of these countries. So I want to talk about what that framework really looks like and how we can exert American power to try to implement democratic change through the lens of Cuba and Venezuela. So starting with Venezuela. Each of these different elements, whether it's the diplomatic, the informational, military, or economic, require an overarching strategic goal for that approach. So when it came to our diplomatic efforts in Venezuela, our objective was to simultaneously isolate the Maduro regime from its foreign allies like Russia and China, and protect the security and unity of the opposition members so that they could focus their efforts on mobilization. And bear that in mind, because this is, as we get to the end of this conversation, you'll see where that went very well and where that went very poorly. But the objective was to enable the interim government, the opposition of Venezuela, to mobilize the people of Venezuela, to increase the internal pressure while we were focusing on external pressure. So what were some of the things that we did? Well, we were able to rally over 60 countries to recognize the leadership of interim President Juan Guaido, which is a fairly unprecedented activity to get, many countries in the European Union to say that election was illegitimate, and we are now recognizing this other official who is constitutionally the president of Venezuela. The idea behind those countries was to make sure that they would undertake initiatives to protect Venezuelan assets from graft from the Maduro regime. We also worked heavily, and I think this is something that people underappreciate when it comes to foreign policy. One major component of foreign policy is to be able to have bipartisan consensus. We did not have that on Cuba, as I'm sure you guys know. We did end up having it on Venezuela, and it was a huge help for us. Because if you can show unity within the country, that's something that foreign adversaries are looking at, and they'll know that you're very serious when you make certain threats. So having that bipartisan consensus is actually a critical part of American credibility abroad, and potentially one of the reasons why American credibility has waned over the years as we've become more hyper-partisan as a country. We also wanted to utilize what were tools used diplomatically in the past, but hadn't been used over the last few years. So one of those is an older treaty relationship known as the Rio Treaty. So the Rio Treaty is basically the Western Hemisphere's version of NATO. It is a security alliance between the various countries in the Western Hemisphere that's committed to the preservation of democracy in the region. We decided to use the Rio Treaty for the first time, invoke it for the first time since September 11th, 2001, in an effort to empower the region to undertake steps that they did not have the legal authority to do individually. So what I mean by that is, in the United States, if we want to implement sanctions, we have the infrastructure to do that. A country like Brazil does not have the unilateral infrastructure to do that. But if it agrees to sanctions in an organization like the Rio Treaty, they are able to enforce that kind of economic pressure. So this was a way of building both diplomatic as well as law enforcement support and economic support to assist our allies in fighting against the Maduro regime. We also worked within the Lima Group, which was another organization led by the region, trying to promote democracy in Venezuela. And we also supported allies that were suffering from the crisis, because the last thing you want to do is have allies do the right thing, like accepting 6 million refugees, and then have them suffer as a result and not be able to maintain their own economies in order to provide refuge for them. So that was the diplomatic end, was creating this block of countries that would make it clear to China and Russia that the costs would be too high for them to try to intervene in support of the Maduro regime, and also to enable the interim government to focus internally on mobilization rather than focusing externally on gaining recognition. The second piece of the framework on Venezuela was the informational piece. So this was public diplomacy to the Venezuelan people in an effort to show that there's a viable alternative to the Maduro regime. So again, the concept behind all of this is when you're talking about American power, particularly as it relates to democratic transitions in another country, you have to always be mindful that you can only do so much, and that the real power comes from within the country. So the informational piece was really trying to ensure that people were receiving information about the Maduro regime, what it was doing, and were able to organize themselves in a safer manner. So the things that we did on this front, one thing that I thought was really unique is we had regular broadcasting from our ambassador. So he would literally host a television show every week, showcasing what the opposition is doing. And they actually ended up having hundreds of thousands of views every single episode. So this was another creative approach that we took, very similar to some of the techniques that we used during the Cold War as well, to sort of like, it's called propaganda, but it really is an effort to kind of demonstrate what's going on inside the country. We also provided VPNs so that the Venezuelan people could safely access the internet without being surveilled. This is really important because China provides a lot of surveillance technology to Venezuela. So making sure that they have an opportunity to combat that and gain access, free access to information was very important. Also so that they could organize and mobilize, because they needed to communicate using Wi-Fi channels to do that. Also, something that people don't often think of when you talk about foreign policy is that the organization of your bureaucracy matters a lot. And so what we elected to do in the last administration was to have an Office of the Special Representative for Venezuela. It sounds very simple, but having a position like that highlights to the people of Venezuela, as well as to the Maduro regime, that this is a significant priority and that all of our resources are being directed towards it. So even little things, bureaucratic steps like that, are part of the tools of our national power that can be deployed in an effective way. And then I think on the informational piece, something that we tried to do, I want to say to varying levels of success, was to be extraordinarily clear about what it would take in order to get the sanctions removed. We felt like we were being clear, but us saying things and that being received are two very different principles. And so I think there was a lot of room for improvement on that front for what exactly it would take for the Maduro regime to do in order to get our sanctions lifted. Going into the military piece, what we were hoping to do, and I'll talk about how this was in retrospect a mistake, was to have a credible threat of injury to the Maduro regime and its insiders on a personal level. Why? Because for many people who are in the Maduro government, the idea of being sanctioned was way less scary than the idea of Maduro throwing you in prison and potentially, torturing you or your family. It's very hard to have economic pressure ever match the physical threat that's being posed by a dictatorship. So having a credible military threat was something that we believed at the time would be very important, even though there wasn't ever really an intention to, as Bolton had his, if anybody remembers that yellow legal pad, 20,000 Colombians into Venezuela. So that was intended as a credible threat, but we will talk a little bit about where that went wrong. And it has a lot to do with miscalculating people's impressions of American power. We did have a lot on the law enforcement side, which I see connected to the military piece, which is trying to undergo a series of indictments and so on to hold the Maduro regime accountable. So again, to show that even if there's not rule of law in Venezuela, there is rule of law internationally. And so our justice system worked very hard on indictments against the Maduro regime and also in interdicting Maduro regime officials as they were transiting Europe or other countries. The last piece of the DIME framework is the economic piece, which I think you're all familiar with when it came to Venezuela. And I think part of my conversation here is to show that that was not the only part of our strategy inside Venezuela. But I want to explain what we were using these tools for. So on the individual side, individualized sanctions named individuals. The goal was to serve as a deterrent for bad behavior. So essentially to say, if you torture someone, you will be sanctioned. And so we implemented, I want to say 700 or 800 of those individual sanctions following negative behavior. On the other hand, the sectoral sanctions on the oil sector, on gold mining, those were intended to compel the Maduro regime to go to the negotiating table. The idea there being, if we've created this sanctions regime, then once the Maduro regime effectively and in good faith goes to negotiate, then we will start walking back those sanctions, but they need to take a step forward in that direction before we do so. In addition, on the economic side, we froze a number of assets, billions of dollars worth of assets, so the Maduro regime could not access them. And we also worked to provide assets to the Venezuelan people. So what we did was not only over $1 billion in humanitarian aid, but I mentioned the VPNs that we provided. We also were able to provide access to digital wallets and worked with the interim government to provide cash infusions to those digital wallets to the Venezuelan people so that they could continue to operate and have some sense of an economy outside the purview of Nicolas Maduro. So collectively, the sort of overarching vision of our strategy in Venezuela was pointing towards, number one, internal mobilization on the part of the Venezuelan people, while the United States and our network of allies provided political and economic support and cover, basically protecting those who would ultimately choose to mobilize inside the country so that we didn't get mass murders the way we had started to see in 2014 during the protests. And we also were hoping that we would, through our sanctions regime, enable those who are one or two steps removed from the regime to recognize that the costs are simply too high for continuing to support Nicolas Maduro. If you can pull those away from him, then potentially he'll feel more exposed. That combined with internal and external pressure was our sort of vision for how this might eventually end. Before I get into what worked and what didn't work there, I want to briefly touch on Cuba and talk about our strategy as it relates to Cuba. So one of the most important things about Cuba is recognizing that unlike Venezuela, which had bipartisan support, Cuba has never had bipartisan support. It's one of the biggest lightning rods in American foreign policy, and it's one of those issue areas that can really make or break people's careers. It's very difficult to touch Cuba in any tangible way and be able to continue into a Senate-confirmed position, for example. So it's a very challenging issue to be working on. Recognizing that, one of the most important themes that we saw in Cuba was to reframe the discussion on Cuba to not being about Cuba policy, but to being about human rights policy. Because that was ultimately why we cared about Cuba in the first place. I mentioned all the arbitrary arrests and torture that we were seeing there. So what did we do on the diplomatic end in order to reframe the discussion to be about human rights? So first, we announced a new policy, which was known as NSPM 5, and this was the policy that dictated the rest of our actions. What this policy essentially said was that we are going to target any entity that disproportionately benefits the military, economic, or the military, intelligence, or security forces of Cuba. The idea here being, while we recognize that the Cuban people and the Cuban government are intimately tied together, as happens in any communist system, we want to target those things that are disproportionately benefiting the government at the expense of the people. We also implemented global Magnitsky sanctions for the first time in the context of Cuba, which was on the Ministry of the Interior following significant arrests and harassment that we had seen on the island. On the informational side, I would say we failed. We did not really communicate well enough what our intentions were to the Cuban people. Part of it is the access is more limited, but I think there was a lot of opportunity to, for example, take what the embassy does in Cuba, which is they have these small networks, sort of burgeoning professional networks. They try to do kind of entrepreneurship, education, and things like that. That is ripe for somebody to come in and create business associations. Now, why do business associations matter? Because business associations are groups of people who are collectively working together in the pursuit of a common business goal. They are the foundation of a future political party. And so had we, for example, invested more in some of that activity, that would have been an example of a creative informational strategy that we could have used in order to push forward a sort of pro-human rights agenda on the island. But we didn't end up doing that. So if anybody ends up working on Cuba in the future, you get that suggestion for free. Military, zero reference to the military. This has a lot to do with history. There's no way that anybody would be able to get away with any kind of credible military threat on the island, just given Bay of Pigs and just the history of our intervention there. It wouldn't have been even remotely appropriate. It also wouldn't have been remotely believable. So it wasn't worth using that threat or any other real kind of kinetic action. And then finally, on the economic piece for Cuba, this is where we probably did make the best inroads. The idea here was, in a communist system, it can be, they tend to have their resources focused on and their income focused on only a few areas. They're not especially diversified. So the three areas in Cuba are their medical missions program, which is where they export doctors and other professionals to other countries. They call it humanitarian. It ends up being slave labor, and if it were humanitarian, they wouldn't be being paid billions of dollars to do it. There is also the tourism component, and then there's remittances, which are cash payments that are made by family members abroad that then go into the Cuban system. So we focused on these three issues, these three areas when it came to our sanctions policies. On the medical missions piece, we actually didn't approach that from an economic angle. We approached it from a diplomatic angle. We tried to get other countries to agree to renegotiate their deals for doctors in an effort that would preserve the freedoms of the doctors themselves. And what we saw happen is what we expected to happen, which is Cuba refused to sign the agreement because they rely on these doctors being enslaved, and then the programs were canceled. So it happened in a handful of countries, not as many as we would have liked, but certainly more than we had been anticipating. And so that was using the UN system for the first time in a productive way when it relates to American policy inside Cuba. On the tourism piece, this is where we did a lot in terms of ending people-to-people travel, which was typically being used by the Castro regime in order to make more money for Cuban government officials. But what we did at the same time was we wanted to make it clear that we weren't just trying to isolate the island. Again, this is a message that didn't get communicated as widely as I wish. But what we established was the prohibited accommodations list. The idea of this was we do not want Americans going to Cuba and staying in hotels that are owned by the Cuban government for two reasons. Number one, that's money that's being taken out of the pockets of the Cuban people. Number two, the chances of your being surveilled significantly are extraordinarily high, almost 100%. So if you've ever stayed in a Cuban hotel, you left anything in that room at any point, passport, laptop, notebook, that information was absolutely read by Cuban intelligence. There are actually a number of American spies that were recruited from the Cubans because of prior trips to Cuba, where they wrote about sympathies to the Cuban regime. They were then recruited to do spying on the United States. So it was a security issue for the Americans, but also, frankly, an economic issue as well. So the prohibited accommodations list basically says you can't stay at those hotels, but where you can stay are Airbnbs owned by the Cuban people, trying to, again, funnel that tourism that we know we're not going to stop fully into providing an economic benefit to the people of Cuba. Those were a few of the things that we tried to do on the economic piece when it came to Cuba. So the most interesting part of the conversation, what worked and what didn't work. And I tend to be fairly open about what worked and what didn't work. So with Cuba, I might be going out on a limb here. I think a lot of what we did happened to be more successful than other Cuba approaches in the past. This was because we really did try to root it in the human rights conversation. And so let me just give you an example of why I think it worked. Well, number one, for many decades, Cuba had been an impediment to our relationships with other countries. Colombia, Brazil, basically any country in the Western Hemisphere was very upset by American foreign policy towards Cuba. We benefited from a change in governments from a number of those countries. This was the first time that our policy inside Cuba was supported by the majority of the Western Hemisphere. So that was a unique case. Another thing is that the people of Cuba became much more politically active, largely because they were realizing that there was so much pressure and attention on the Cuban regime if they were to get arrested. So this resulted in actually the largest protest that we had seen up until the Trump administration at the end, December of 2020. And then in July of 2021, we saw even more wide-scale protests with hundreds of people out on the street, which really doesn't happen in Cuba. So we did help mobilize the people of Cuba. Also, I mentioned the rate of arbitrary arrests as to why we decided to reform this. So we saw the rate of human rights abuses, including arbitrary arrests, plummet really quite exponentially. So we saw it go from 4,537 in 2017. Again, that's down from the almost 10,000 in 2016, to 2,000 in 2018, to 1,800 in 2019, to 1,028 in 2020. Now, I don't attribute this exclusively to American foreign policy, but I do think it means a lot that the regime knew that we were watching. They knew that we were going to implement sanctions, and that credibility, again, that credible threat, in this case, a non-kinetic credible threat, did, I think, have a significant role to play. According to Human Rights Watch, the same number of people detained in the entirety of 2020 were detained in the course of 1 month in 2021. Again, the messaging coming from this administration that they were not going to continue the pursuit of the Trump administration's policies. So I think there was some work that was successful on Cuba. We don't have a Castro in charge anymore. That had nothing to do with our policy, but I think that's always good news too, and an opportunity for this administration and other administrations to potentially lead to more democratic change on the island. Venezuela is a different story. I don't know how many of you guys have been watching what's going on in Venezuela today, but the gist of it is we are probably as far away from a democratic transition in Venezuela as we ever have been, and I do not just blame, the last year for that. I think there's a lot of things that were done incorrectly in my administration that hopefully will provide useful background for those of you who will be going into an administration role in the future. So number one, what didn't work? You really need to care about what matters to the regime and not just assume that they care about the same things that you do. This is a perennial problem in the United States across the board. I had dinner with some folks last night and breakfast as well, and we spoke a little bit about this, that there is a significant role of ideology in other countries in their foreign policy and domestic policy that we don't really have the equivalent of in this country. And we need to recognize the role of ideology and know that that is a real thing, and it's not just that we can buy people out of a process. So that's one thing. I think we assumed that sanctioning Maduro would scare him, but what we didn't realize is that all he needs is not enough money to run the country. He just needs enough money to pay the graft to the Cubans and the Venezuelan generals that are protecting him. And frankly, as pervasive as the American economic system is, we weren't able to cut off all of that supply because he has narcotics and he has the illicit gold trade. So we weren't able to squeeze him in a way that I think would have been effective. I also mentioned that our strategy relied on building a network of support. But something that I think we did poorly was, while we did have other members supporting our alliance, it was ultimately seen as our alliance. It was not seen as a regionally led effort, even though it really, frankly, was. And so that meant that we were often trying to demonstrate that America was being so strong and look at all the great things that we're doing. But it wasn't, and Colombia is coming alongside, it wasn't about the region really leading. And I think we lost a lot of momentum from that as well. I mentioned the military threat and how I think that that was a mistake. When you have a credible threat, you need to make sure that you're not disincentivizing your allies. So Maduro thought that we might go to war. That was great for him to think. But the Europeans also thought that we might go to war, and that was a huge problem for us, because the way that we always saw this was, in foreign policy, specifically when it related to Venezuela, we're on a highway. And every economic sanction, every policy that we implement is an off-ramp to being on that highway where the end result is a military conflict. So every time we implemented a sanction, the idea was to pull us away from potentially needing to deploy military force. Well, the Europeans heard us talking about military force, and they saw every sanction that we put on as a foot on the accelerator to war. And that meant that they were not willing to join us in a lot of our initiatives that would have been much more successful had they had European support. I'm talking about things like asset freezes, travel bans, the various things that, the Maduro regime can't go to Florida, but they can go to Spain. And they did go to Spain. And I think a lot of that came from our mixed messaging when it came to the military threat. And that stems a lot from American military intervention and its history in the region, more than I think necessarily just the Trump administration, but I think it was a combination of both of those things. There was also a lot of mixed messaging and timing issues. Some of this is unavoidable. An example that I would give is, I mentioned the importance of being clear about when we're removing sanctions. Well, we implemented something called the Framework for a Democratic Transition in Venezuela, which laid out exactly what the Maduro regime needed to do in order for us to remove sanctions. 1 week later, the Department of Justice announced its indictment on Nicolas Maduro. Fully support that indictment. The timing was hugely problematic because they saw that we just gave this sort of opening and then they saw us slam the door shut. So that was a huge error. It's almost impossible to avoid for those of you who want to work at the State Department. You are not authorized to have coordination with the Department of Justice. So it was very challenging to get around that. But it is something to be mindful of. Again, the way our system works sometimes works against our priorities. Finally, I think a major failing was too much emphasis on the interim government serving as a government and not enough emphasis on the interim government serving as a mobilization force inside Venezuela. So that's problematic for two reasons. Number one, they don't actually have the constitutional legitimacy to be a government. They are the government in order to organize free and fair elections. That is their constitutional role, and everything that we did was based on the Venezuelan constitution. The other reason it's a problem is that them working on getting a passport for a Venezuelan is not going to do anything to get Maduro out of power. So we needed to have them be working on mobilization while we were working on providing them the economic, political, and security cover to do so without being attacked by the regime. So that was another area where I think we put way too much emphasis on them being a government and not enough emphasis on them being an opposition force mobilizing their own people. So a few lessons that I see on how to properly deploy the tools of national power as well as additional tools that we may have. So first and foremost, external, when you're dealing with democratic change in countries, external cannot replace the internal. Mobilization, inspiring the people to believe there's a possibility of change and inspiring them to take on that change themselves is one of the most critical pieces of it. The people of Venezuela needed to be leading the process, and while they were, the messaging from the United States made it sound like it was us. And I think that was hugely problematic and discouraging for the people inside Venezuela. That also relates to the second point, which is what is the role of the United States? We need to figure out how to provide the appropriate combination of pressure and release valves for the regime. And I think there was too much emphasis on the optics of America being strong and powerful and aggressive against the Maduro regime. There wasn't enough emphasis on our actual policy, which was open to a negotiation process. So that mixed messaging, I think, was very challenging because it made it unclear for the casual observer what the role of the United States really was. The third piece, timing matters, not just with respect to the justice, state issue, but also the largest set of sanctions we deployed was deployed on January 24th, 2019, which was the first set of sanctions that we really implemented fully against a sector, which was our oil sanctions. The idea behind that was if you hit them extraordinarily hard, then they'll capitulate right away. The problem is there's a risk. If they don't capitulate right away, then they will learn how to deal with those sanctions and get around them, and you'll never have a stronger bullet to fire. And so that, I think, was a strategic miscalculation on the part of the White House and the State Department. So timing really does matter, and figuring out what are the various resources you have and being thoughtful about when you deploy each of them is especially significant. I think also number 4 is that credibility matters, including credibility with dictators. So we always talk about we don't want to negotiate with dictators. Truthfully, the way any of this has ever been resolved is somebody negotiated with somebody. So that's how all of these end. So as much as we say we don't negotiate, we do. And the problem is we had never established credibility with the Maduro regime. It sounds kind of weak to say like, well, why should we have to establish credibility with this dictatorial regime? Well, because we want there to be freedom for the people of Venezuela. So we needed to demonstrate a good faith effort at the same time that the Maduro regime needed to demonstrate a good faith effort. I'm not certain that we did that very effectively. The last two are that timing matters, credibility matters, and politics matter. Many of you are probably optimistic that you can enter foreign policy and only deal with foreign policy. You cannot. Politics are going to come into it, as horrifying and grotesque as politics are, and you will have to consider that. You will have to be mindful of that. An example of this is there was a situation where there were two former military members who went to Venezuela. Some of you may remember this. Their intention was to assassinate Nicolas Maduro. The United States had zero to do with this plot, but the problem was American politics wanted to believe that this is exactly something that the Trump administration would do. It wasn't like a especially hard leap for some of them. So that meant that we spent 3 to 4 months just trying to convince Congress that we hadn't had anything to do with it. That was 3 to 4 months that we did absolutely nothing else because we were constantly getting hauled in, we were constantly getting asked questions. Now, this is a good thing in general, right? You want your media to hold your political figures accountable because if we had been involved in that, that is absolutely something that the media and Congress should hold our feet to the fire for. It just so happened that in this particular case, it wasn't true, and so it meant that our policy couldn't move forward because we were just trying to prove that we didn't know about something, which is exceptionally challenging to prove. So politics really does have a role to play, and you have to be mindful of the political consequences. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue good policy. It just means you need to know how to mitigate some of the political threats as a result. And then last but not least, is our biggest strength is also a significant obstacle. Democracies are never going to be as flexible or as responsive as dictatorships are. It's the nature of the beast. One guy can decide whatever he wants. In our system, you have to go through multiple levels, multiple layers, and multiple different people. So recognizing that and building that into your decision-making process and understanding how do decisions get made, not just what is good policy, but how do you turn good policy into an actual implemented approach, that is something that people completely undervalue in Washington, D.C. And if you can go to Washington with the ability to operationalize ideas, you will be infinitely more successful than your peers because so many people will spend their time getting PhDs in a regional issue and working for the State Department and never knowing how to turn their brilliant idea into an actual outcome. So emphasizing that and understanding how the bureaucracy works and trying to learn that, whether it's through internships, whether it's through your networking conversations, is, I think, a critical part of being successful. And as I said, the structure and process is a part of the tools of our national power, even if it can sometimes be limiting.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.